Good afternoon, guys. Now we've got a panel discussion on moving towards a data-rich and collaborative marine industry. This is a discussion-based panel, so please submit your questions via the live discussion link and I will put them to our panelists. This is going to be moderated by Denis Morais from SSI. I'll hand it over to you guys. Thank you.
Great. So I am Denis Morais. I am the co-CEO of SSI, and I will be moderating these gentlemen. Hopefully they don't get too much out of line. So the topic of our panel is collaboration across the industry for data standardization and data exchange. This will be the panel that everyone will be talking about. And I would say probably the only panel that the panelists have guaranteed me that they're wearing pants. So on a more serious note, if we look at any of these digital technologies and innovations that we're planning on implementing, it all requires this digital information. And digital information is going to be created and used throughout several different phases, or created and used through several different phases, as well as they'll be created through or created by different organizations. As well, because it's created by different organizations, it's also going to be created by different software vendors and applications. This means data might be connected, it may be disconnected. As well as when we're talking about information, it's not just the 3D CAD model, the BOMs or the metadatas or requirements, specifications, or even real-time data. It's all this information, and it's how this information is connected or related with one another throughout the life cycle. But also dealing with all this digital innovation, it's going to require a different digital workforce, as well as potentially different tools, but probably more importantly, a different mindset or culture. So the way that we're going to structure this panel is break it up into three main sections. We'll try to have even amount of time for each of these sections, but depending on the questions and the answers will be dependent on if we can do that. So the first area will be focused more on the integration of the digital innovation. Then we'll talk a little bit more about the common data standards across the industry. And then we'll try to touch into creating a digital workforce that that is equipped with the digital capabilities. So at this time, one last point on that is a lot of this information has been discussed through other presentations. However, I have to say I really do like panels, mainly because they are not scripted and they're pretty raw. So this does allow us to have a better sense of, we'll say, the reality of our environment. So this way, I'll take the opportunity to have the panelists introduce themselves, as well as their companies and any past experience that is related to the discussion topics. So I'm not sure who wants to go first. Peter?
All right, I will take that up. Thank you very much. Appreciate the invite and the opportunity to talk more about things that are very passionate to me and my company, CIMdata. So I am the president and CEO, so Peter Bolello, president and CEO of CIMdata. CIMdata is a strategic management consulting firm that's been in and around the PLM industry from, well, before it existed as a term. We were actually founded in the early 1980s, working with clients since then to figure out what they should be doing, the application of technologies, process changes, and organizational changes to support various aspects of their product lifecycle. During that time, I've been with the company now for 23, almost 24 years. I myself have worked with a number of marine companies, from small companies that are owned by still by the family, a number of them in Northern Europe, for example, in Germany and the Netherlands, to some of the larger, DoD type contractors like Huntington Ingalls and others. We've also worked for BAE Submarines and others in Europe as well, and actually even worked with some marine firms in China. And there are a lot of similarities around the world and what they're trying to deal with. Their technologies could be quite a bit different. Their reliance on labor could be quite a bit different, but the reality is the business is much more similar than it is different. And we have the experience, and me personally, but our business as well, is helping people around the world in many industries, not just the marine, to, again, understand what lifecycle management is and how to better take advantage of the way it has evolved over time to allow for better ways of working and driving both process and product innovation.
Adam, do you want to?
Yeah, so I'm Adam Sovie. I'm an associate professor in the Maritime Engineering Group at the University of Southampton, and also group lead for Marine and Maritime at the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK's National Institute for Artificial Intelligence. So my job's really on the research side, development of fundamental AI techniques. So I generally work with evolutionary computation and learning in continuous environments, for those of you who are familiar with those techniques, and then applying them to stuff generally in the marine domain, normally structures, but sometimes outside of that as well. So in my career, I've worked with the UK leisure boat building industry, UK MOD, currently working with Shell Shipping and Maritime on powering predictions, working with Lloyd's Register on digital twins, and working with voyage optimization software as well. So I've got a range of experience across different sectors, all related into sort of machine learning, AI. So hopefully that's useful to everyone.
No, sounds awesome. Okay, so the first question to lead up to it. So we pretty much all conceptually understand the importance of information and data to flow through the entire value chain. And this could be considered the cradle to grave. And we hear a lot of buzzwords and methodologies and technologies such as digital twin, digital thread, MBE, immersive technology, advanced manufacturing, AR, VR, 3D printing, smart everything, digital everything. So from all these, we hear, again, countless number of benefits of streamlining this information. Now, my question is, could you distill it to the biggest or the top two benefits or opportunities, and why would you say that?
So the biggest benefits in streamlining data?
Yeah, throughout the entire value chain.
That's a kind of couple-hour discussion right there.
Well, the key idea is trying to get down to one of the biggest or most significant issues from your perspective. And the challenge and what I'm trying to ask here is there's just so many, and a lot of times we always talk about trying to be very focused and defining our goals. So with that, I'm just trying to get your perspective.
Yeah, no, it's a great topic to discuss. I'll give you my view on it, and I'm sure Adam will add and have other views as well. But if you really can, or really do that end to end, that's one of the issues that we see in not just the marine industry, but some others, is there's very few that have a full end to end vision. Now, part of that is because a lot of times the owner operator is a different group than the people that actually did design and construction and even commissioning of the boat or ship. So there's some disconnect there. And as a result, the benefits to one group may not be the benefits to the other group from a life cycle perspective. But I think, truly, if everyone had a total cost of ownership perception and expectation, then they both should care about getting the data and that connectivity, as you mentioned, data, the digital twin, the digital thread. And then the benefits, if you do that, then is around total cost of ownership, or lowering the total cost of ownership, making sure that vessel is always operational, it's always maintained in the best form possible, and being able to be better prediction of maintenance requirements of the ship. And just looking at some of the ancillary or secondary support of ships, for example, in the marine industry, you have companies like Shell and others that are doing lubricants. And the better they understand the performance of the ship itself that they're performing maintenance on, or just providing oils for, they can better stage where does that oil have to be, what port does it have to be in, when to go do that. So the more visibility or more connected that product is, that ship is, the better the maintenance can be. And again, the more uptime that ship can be, and you're not sitting in a port somewhere waiting for maintenance. And that total cost of ownership, I mean, the owner wants to be able to use that ship all the time. Whenever they're ready to use it, they want to be able to use it. But if it's being maintained out of sequence, or when it's not planned for, then it becomes more cost. So I would say, end to end, I would look at that as being the biggest potential value. But that means the development house and the commissioning and the owner operator has to understand the end to end view, and that's where you would look at total cost of ownership. That's one of the things I see, at least in my work, where the value can come and be pretty significant.
Perfect.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from my perspective, it would make my life a lot easier if things were streamlined. There's so many different types of data out there and everyone's storing it differently. It's really hard to get to. But I think more significantly, it means that people will stop losing their data. I talk to companies all the time who say they have 20 or 30-year records. And what they really mean is they've got a basement somewhere with full of cobwebs with some documents down there that there's no way you can strip all that data out of it. And again, in 20 or 30 years' time, when these ships stop operating, if we haven't streamlined things, if we haven't got single codes of conduct, then we're not going to have today's data useful to us to be able to use in tools in the future. And I think for Marine, that's particularly significant because we work in such a stochastic variable environment that actually a lot of what we're interested in doesn't happen very often. And so when we do see it, it's totally important to capture that information and be able to store it and reuse it in the future. We have a lot of sort of benign events where we get a lot of data, but we actually don't see our sort of interesting, significant things very often. And sort of streamlining that and being able to share that, I think, is really key to making the most of these tools.
Perfect. Yeah, and I totally agree. I was just the one of the reasons I was asking is because there's a lot of streamlining for producing better quality, we'll say vessels, but not from a better quality from an owner's operator perspective. And I think that kind of the goal that you're kind of mentioning, that it's from, at the end of the day, it's from the low cost of ownership. If that's driving it, I think it starts answering a lot of these questions and some of the challenges that we have in the industry, from communication, from the shipbuilders to the owner operators. There's a connection, there's a gap in a lot of cases. So that really starts driving that is an important aspect that we might have to focus on. So another question I'm going to have about information in general of passing it through, and I think, Adam, we did touch base on this very quickly before, is, we've all heard the saying about garbage in, garbage out. And there's quite a few people that say that legacy data is not useful because it is garbage. And with ships taking many years to move from concept to customer delivery, as well as these lifespans going from 3 to 5 decades, we're going to have a lot of legacy data for the foreseeable future. So I guess my question is, what are your thoughts on if and how we can leverage this legacy data, or should we just pretty much start from scratch?
I don't know. I guess my viewpoint is I never like to throw data away because we never have enough of it. And I think, I don't know, my feeling is a lot of the legacy data is still quite useful. It's about how you interpret and use it. I find a lot of the times when we're looking at data, we look at it with our engineering hats on. And so we say, I'm a naval architect. I would solve this problem using X, Y, and Z variables, which is good. And that's a nice way to make sure we're physics-based and we have an understanding. But sometimes we can look at this from a data perspective, look at the ways which things are correlating, and perhaps gain our naval architecture variables that we want through some different variables, another set of variables. And so I think it's always worth looking at the legacy data in that respect. Even if you don't think it's useful up front, some of these measurements might lead you to some conclusions that are quite useful. So I think all of that legacy data can have a good application. You probably just need to be a little bit more wary when using it than you would be with other data, perhaps.
Perfect. Peter.
Yeah. Let me kind of add to that. I fully agree with Adam on, can never have too much data, but you could be overwhelmed with data. So having data, so that you can learn from the past, understand and leverage. So it has to become knowledge, but the knowledge requires, some context. It needs understanding. It needs, the right format so people can understand it. And I look at, legacy data. These, as you mentioned, Dennis, there's projects that go on for decades, and then the maintenance of that data goes along, or should go along with the maintenance of that vessel, and that could be, as you mentioned, decades. I was thinking of the submarine business, where it's 50, 60 years useful life, and aircraft carriers, I'm being told it's like 100 years useful life. And think about the iterations of data. I mean, of course, the ship's going to get upgraded. There's going to be major upgrades to different systems and subsystems. But if you really want to be able to maintain the ship is a result of the information. So information has to be maintained. And I've seen some major initiatives where they've had to, as during the development cycle, they've had to switch out their computer-aided design system, their mechanical computer-aided design system. And they looked at, okay, well, we haven't built ship one yet. We've laid, maybe some of the major components of it, but we still haven't finished design yet. We're still designing and we're constructing, and we're switching out a major development tool at the same time. So then you start looking, okay, what formats do I have? What neutral formats can I use? How can I get parameters and other things over? It's not just about the design, it's about the context of that design and other things. And there's been programs, major programs that have gone through that in the shipbuilding industry that I'm aware of. And keeping the data in a way that's useful is really important, or it's just, you throw it away. It's not, or you put it in a corner somewhere or in a filing cabinet, no one has access to it or can't get value out of it. It's pointless. And it kind of reminds me of a discussion I've had some years ago with CERN. So the people in CERN, they're in, France and I think it's France and Switzerland, if I remember correctly. The super colliders, actually, there's between those two countries, it actually exists, or including both of those countries. And they said they started gathering design data and decisions back when they started the conceptual design of that super collider. And they said one of the reasons they did that is because they knew that a number of the PhD people that were working on it would be retired, if not passed away by that time. So they said we need to start collecting that right up front. We got dozens of years, if maybe a couple of decades before we turn this thing on, and we're going to need to then maintain it long term. So, and the shipbuilding industry is very similar, that a lot of the designs happen many years before. Things get changed out as you go through the process. Things have to be maintained even as you're constructing the ship. And if that data doesn't flow through and you aren't ready and willing to make changes to that data in the data format, you're going to probably lock it away. So that's, I'm sure we'll talk more about standards, but that's where one of the hope, and I put hopes around quotes, that standards will solve all the problems. I personally don't think it'll solve all the problems, but it can be helpful in solving some of the problems. So that value comes in the reusability of the information and the connectivity of that information from a lifecycle perspective. And again, it's not just about the design aspects of it, but construction and, of course, commissioning, and then ultimately maintenance.
Yeah, definitely. From what you're saying, we're having a little bit about the standard discussion there, which I think got me a couple more questions I'm going to ask on that part now. But I guess my next question, and this is another very broad question, and it's intentionally made broad just to kind of get your guys' perspective, and each one might have a different area of focus. But when we're looking at to support, we'll say, this digital backbone of all of our information, we're going to have to evolve our current technology architecture, or many organizations are. And I'm trying to, I guess the question is, what does this future architecture look like? How will we know if the architecture is mature enough for this digital transformation? Yeah, so start with that question and see where it goes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of tough in the fact that it's quite broad, and there are so many different types of architecture, from sort of AI machine learning architectures to database architectures to company architectures. I guess from my perspective, it's interesting because from a university, that's what we're trying to develop. We're trying to look at what are we developing for 10 or 20 years time, and that's basically what we'll be working on today. So I think my concern is that there is generally less funding in this area in development of new things, and I think we have a bit of a tendency to be trying to reuse our current architectures in sort of bigger ways. And so my feeling is that in 10 or 20 years time, I think our architectures fundamentally might not be looking that different from what they look like now. They will probably just be on bigger computers. They'll be more complex, and perhaps we'll understand them a little bit better. And I don't know whether that's a positive or a negative. So I think there's some good and some bad in that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, when I look at architectures, I kind of think of them or divide them between data architectures and information technology architectures. So, those things that operate on the data. And, data architectures themselves, kind of, you get back to standards again. And one of the things that I think we're finally seeing changes in the marine industry, or the technologies supporting the marine industry, is a more openness to those architects, to the data itself. So if I look at it from someone who's doing the design work, should I lock away my intellectual property within a data structure that's proprietary to this technology or this other technology? Most companies would say, no, I don't want to do that. That's my IP. I want it in a form that it's transportable, right? I want to upgrade my CAD system, for example, or whatever requirements management system, whatever it might be. It's upgradable. And really, that's where the owner operators should care, because they want the data, or at least they should want the data as well. MOD cares about it, DoD cares about it. They want the data so that they can then do maintenance, or Babcock can do maintenance for MOD or whatever the structure is. And there's a number of different structures out there. And we're starting to see that from a technology perspective, where some of the major vendors are more opening up their architectures from a data perspective, allowing people to get access to the data without having to go through proprietary means to go do it. And that is part of the, I would say, what we're seeing in the IT space, where this concept around platformization of technologies, where the platform itself is upgradable, flexible, scalable, available, but open as well. So that it gets more down to, I would like to use the example of an iPhone or Android device, where you have a hardware platform, you have a software platform, and then you have applications, and they do interrelate, but they can be upgraded at different times, and you're pretty much guaranteed that they're interoperable. Where in most IT space around product development, that hasn't been naturally or typically the case. But we're starting to see some of the major vendors that are supporting major large-scale development projects that you would see in marine, for example, starting to do that, building out the IT side of the architectures to be, again, more open, upgradable, more as platforms. And then, as Adam said, being able to leverage then newer technologies to go support that. And the machines are getting bigger, or maybe going to the cloud, be more, that's today's solution anyway for scalability, for example, especially in the area of design and simulation, and almost ultimate open computing environments. But if the data is not open, then it's still not going to be very transportable long term. So you really need, in my view, to have both open architectures from a IT perspective and then a data perspective.
Yeah, and I think just picking up on that, it's interesting that we're in a PostMoores Law world now. So so computers aren't just getting bigger and bigger, and well, it's getting bigger, but not at the same rate. And so we will have to be looking to game-changing technologies, or we're going to have to be much smarter with our computational use going forwards than we have been. I think we've been very reliant on the idea that computers will just be bigger in 2 years, so we'll be fine. And that's sort of starting to slow a little bit. I'm sure someone smart will do something with quantum computing or something, and we'll see another uplift. But it's quite hard to predict on some of the sort of medium to long-term timescales when that will happen.
You mean we, as coders, we can't just throw more code at it and hope that the system will overcome it by speed?
Yeah, I mean, for the first time in my career, and it's only been short, but we're having to do memory type coding. So you're optimizing for memory usage, which is something that I've historically never had to do. It's just been about speed or programmer time. Now you're having to definitely bring in you're maxing out RAM capacity and stuff, even on supercomputers. So I think that's a new type of, or probably a skill people used to have a lot more, but we're having to sort of relearn that skill again now.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that the COBOL programmers that used two figures for the because they wanted to save as much memory as possible.
Yeah, we kind of seem to be going a bit back towards that again.
That does remind me of back in when I started, we had our resources were at a premium from processor to memory. So we're getting back to those problems. So I do have a question here from the audience here. Is big data analytics the answer to managing all legacy data moving forward?
I would say no, not at all, actually. But data analytics helps you understand data, but it's not going to help your legacy management of data itself. So it may be part of the solution, but it's not the solution. And there's all course, what kind of analytics are we talking about, right? There's all types of different analytics. It's different application of AI, and various forms of machine learning within that. that can give you insight out of that data, but it's not going to help you manage the data itself. And that's where, data governance and just pure data management is required in some form. And that gets into then, as I mentioned before, about formats and other things that are important, because you can extract value out of it, but you may not be able to actually reuse it if it's not in the right format. So again, part of the answer, but not the answer, at least my view.
Yeah, and I'm about as biased towards wanting to use AI as possible as a developer of these things, but I agree. It's about augmenting. You've got to keep the human in the loop. You're augmenting people's capacity to understand things outside of their domain expertise and try and interrelate those things. I think that's the key part of all of this. Is it's about reducing the complexity of a problem down to something that our brains can handle, or understanding something outside of our domain expertise a little bit better sometimes. So I completely agree with Peter.
Perfect. Okay, I think we're going to move on to standards unless you guys have any additional things to add. No, good. Okay, so standards, definitely I have one of those love-dislike relationships with standards. I definitely love the idea of them streamlining information and we'll say liberating the information across applications and organizations. But I dislike the real world results in general. Obviously there's some standards, I know there's a lot of people that love standards and there's some successes in it, but in general, I would say, at least from the shipbuilding industry, they've been lacking. So with that, what are your thoughts on the ability to create a standard or standards, obviously, to help facilitate information exchange and I guess storage, as you're kind of mentioning there, Peter? And do you feel there's a place for standards, and what would it look like? Who would create it? How will it get maintained, and so forth? And how, I guess another one would be, how fast can it be maintained?
Yeah, all good questions. There's one of the problems is there's too many standards. I mean, there's all kinds of data standards. A few years ago, CIMdata did a research project. This was, again, PLM, product lifecycle management related standards for the aerospace world, aerospace industry. And it was 200 we identified. Various forms that go from standards around the different computer-aided design tools to bill of materials or other information structures, product structures, and so on. So good news is there's standards. The bad news is there's way too many of them. And there's, ISO is a great standards group. There's a lot of standards underneath that. And there's a bunch of other industry action groups and others that support or promote standards. What I hope for is that there'll be more action groups that are independent of standard organizations that then those support the standards and then write into their purchasing guides and others that if they're going to buy a technology, this is the standard, a data standard that it supports and that can output to or some kind of restructures around that. And one of the ones that I've seen used quite successful,y there's a number in the CAD world, but I'm thinking PLCS. I mentioned this in my roundtable yesterday. That's AP 239. And I've seen some really good examples in the marine industry. There was a presentation at a conference, actually one of CIMdata's conferences, from BAE Systems on the aircraft carrier side, where they're using PLCS to hold the ship structure and as maintained view, basically, so that third parties have access to what that structure looks like. So there are some definitely practical standards out there in various aspects of what information you're managing. But if you get into some of the areas like simulation, there's many different standards out there and overlapping standards. So getting into your other side of the question is, how to kind of do it, I think goes back to having action groups that support it and then enforce it. And this is only done through telling your solution provider, if you don't support this standard, we will not buy from you, because it has to have some teeth to it. But that takes time. It takes people cooperating. It does take independent groups like ISO and others to promote and to hopefully bring the right people together to go develop those standards. But it's a long process. I just think of was it IGES standard around CAD, which form of IGES were you really working with? And every form was slightly different. So yeah, a lot of work to do, but there's promise.
Yeah, I think also just building on that, some of it's about deciding to the level of detail that those standards need to have. So I've worked on structure standards before, and it's always very difficult about how prescriptive you might be within those rules and how much you need to stand off. And I completely agree with Peter that it needs industry buy-in to sort of be part of those standards, to to make sure that people actually want to use them. And I think also it's probably about splitting things out a little bit between standards and standardization. So if groups of companies, large groups of companies, agree to use the same process, you don't automatically need to create a formal standard. But if there's enough people all agreeing that they're happy and comfortable going a certain way, then that can be a quicker way to react, possibly without all of the sort of longer term bureaucracy before you decide what you perhaps then put into a longer term standard. And I think, I don't know, it's very difficult. I think people are moving into this world without perhaps having long-term experience of it, and they're trying to use their sort of engineering hats, and it's quite difficult to do. I know class societies are trying to work out where their place in all of this sits next to other standards that might already exist for data that are a bit more long-standing. And I guess we need to, as a community, decide what we need marine-specific standards for and what we can use from other places and convert from there.
So you guys mentioned a couple of questions. So we talk about standards, obviously being multiple standards, and as we know, any information that we have, they're highly connected and related through a lot of other information. So is there an evolution of standards that it's going to relate to other standards? Because again, when you're trying to standardize on information, and the relationships is going to be the key, do you require interconnection between these different standards, or does that encompass a larger standard? Because again, if we look at some of the standards for just the IGES or even the steps and stuff, it has some other additional information, but tying that standard into a different process of your life cycle, how does that get all connected? How do you see that in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of a standard of standards. I want to be on that committee.
Well, that's. Yeah.
But I think I agree with you to some extent. So going back to the structures ISO standard I was on, that worked quite well because it was a set of standards. So you've got structures as part of the hydrodynamics, and there's therefore a range of different standards that all interlink and therefore can talk to each other nicely. And so I think you have to package some of this up. But again, it's a huge area, this, and I don't think that you can perhaps formally connect all of these different standards in that same sort of way. It's a big bunch of stuff to try and to sort of solve in a group. So I guess it's about trying to work out interlinking areas and get companies who are keen to connect these things to sort of get on those committees and start pushing forwards.
Yeah, I'll echo that and kind of expand that a little bit. As you look at going back to what we were talking about before, you have different parties involved. You have the designer, you have a customer, you have maybe someone who's supporting it that could be different. So you have these different factions that are going on that need various aspects of that data to be supported and to be visible for them and usable for them, but they have different needs. So to have an overarching standard that supports every different view of information is complex, especially for a large product like a ship, for example. So I think I wouldn't say it's impossible, but as Adam said, fully agree. There's ISO and a few other standard groups have an ability to do a broader set of standards and try to interconnect them more so than some of the more focused standards that have to do various aspects of the life cycle. They tend to have a bigger, broader aspect of it, but it's still a lot of work. And then you have to get agreement from an owner operator or the maintenance group, which actually may not even be the owner operator, and then the people that actually, the shipyard itself that actually designed the ship, or even a third party that supported the shipyard that designed the ship and then construct it. And there's just so many factions that are going on and different needs that are going on from an information perspective. Getting them all, it's like herding cats, right? Getting them all in the box to agree on a common standard, you end up getting ADA. And for those that are in the computer science world, ADA was a wonderful language that had how many volumes, because you could code every which way you would ever wanted to code. And it was clearly made by committee. So it wasn't a very refined language. It was just an all-encompassing language, which not too many people used, actually, unless it was required by DoD probably, right? So that's my example of a standard. It didn't really work really well because it was too much of a superset.
Yeah. A couple questions here I have is, how do you onboard your supply chain with data standards? I know it was a comment that you mentioned there, Peter.
Well, what came to mind is you force them to. It's not the kind way of doing it, of course. It depends on where you are in the value chain. I mean, if you're a big, the shipyard itself, the one that's doing all the buying, well, that's part of what you're buying is you're buying data. So you can require it to be in a certain form. Now, you should understand you're paying for that. That's valuable. I did some projects with U.S. Army Material Command some years ago, and they're buying all kinds of stuff. And they want to maintain it. They have these depots and maintenance sheds and everything else that they maintain product all around the world. So we told them, if you want to do that, you have to buy the data. And of course, the data then has to be in a format that you're willing to buy or you can use. And for some companies, they understand that, and the shipyard is willing to go do that. For others, they don't want to do it because they feel it's proprietary information. Well, certain structures, I'm sure, are proprietary or should be proprietary, but the owner operator, if they're going to operate and maintain something, they want a configuration or a configured set of information which allows them to maintain it. And unless the shipyard's willing to maintain it and give them a quote to do that, which most don't, they should be willing to sell that data in the right format. And then they then require their suppliers to provide in the right format. Now, in some industries, that's pretty common. Automotive is very common that the OEMs around the world require the data to be in certain formats in order to buy the product from them. And now there's been a lot more outside design resources used in automotive space for a few decades, well, 2 or 3 decades at least. They've been less vertically integrated than the large shipyards have been. So they're used to having third parties doing major design of not just components but systems. And in those cases, you want to, the OEM becomes an integrator. The OEM to integrate has to integrate information, not just the physical product, but the information that does it in the virtual space. So they've dictated for years, it has to be in this CAD system or this format with this structure to it. And then sometimes they say, well, you have to use our systems even. So again, it can be done, but it's usually from the more of the top down, requiring it to be part of your, use the Karatsu, from the Japanese family of companies. If you want to be part of my family, then you have to, use my taxonomy or my data language. But if you get to standards, then you can remove some of the complexity of that. So one other thing I'll add to it is, I was mentioning the other day around our round table that there are some action groups out there, and one that we're supporting that's CIMdata is an aerospace and defense area. And they said, we don't want to create more standards. There's plenty of standards out there. But what we want to do is, as a group, define which standards we want to support, because as an OEM, we're forcing our suppliers to do all kinds of different standards. So Boeing wants it this way, Embraer wants it that way, Airbus wants it another way. That just causes everyone more headache and more cost. It adds time, it adds cost to doing product development. So if people can get together, through a standards group or whatever, or an action group or whatever, industry action group or whatever, then you can actually lower everyone's cost and have a better ability to collaborate on information.
That's an interesting thing. Doing it almost by not industry, but a collection of organizations and companies. But something you did say there that kind of was interesting is there is organizations that push to their subcontractors or their tier partners a CAD application, which is now not really a standard, but it's how they're avoiding standards in essence. That's kind of one of the things.
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the questions I have here, another one is, are we past the point of no return for achieving standardization, or is it achievable goal for the further down the road?
Is this in response to data in general, or
I think it's about the standards.
So I don't think you ever go past that point.
Mm-hmm.
But it probably becomes more tricky for those standards to be very detailed, if that makes sense. So you've got to, if you want to make very detailed determinations on how everything's going to be stored or processed, it's very difficult to do that like late in the game. They're going to be more general standards, unless companies all start to form and join up, and one single thing starts to become clearly the easiest way to store or process data. I think so. We don't really know how things are going forwards, but yeah, if you switch to things like quantum computing, then innately everything's going to be changed up again in the way that you're storing that data and in which you're moving things around, in which case you're coding things. So there's always going to be those breakpoints, those technological breakpoints, which sort of shake everything back up again and allow you to look at those standards, I think. So my answer is probably no.
Yeah, I agree. Probably no. I mean, other things will evolve, as Adam's saying. I fully agree with that. Will require yet another change. That's why I think openness is so important to information. That if you can't extract what that information means, then you're going to lose it. So openness of information, having that readily accessible, so then you can migrate that or transform that into a new form that's needed for support moving forward, and especially with long life products. If you can't move the information forward, then you become less efficient. Ultimately, being able to, the only way to understand and maintain something is by taking it apart. And I look at some other, again, infrastructure, for example. You see this, I had a discussion with Network Rail people in the UK, and they, describing, what information they have. Some of the rail systems in the UK are, hundreds of years old, more than 100 years old, 150, 200 years old in some cases, and they don't have the information anymore. Or if they have it, it may be in a drawing if they're lucky, and it's not in the format. And then they have to say, well, is that drawing even accurate anymore? Did we make a change to it 50 years ago? The drawing is 100 years old. We don't know. And I've seen this, MTA in the U.S. that does in New York, that does the Metropolitan Transit Association, does the subway system in New York City. They had major floods during hurricanes and other things, washes out systems, and that, first of all, no one makes anymore. They don't know exactly what it looks like, and they have to go, kind of figure it out from scratch again, because they have not been able to, perhaps as a polite way of saying it, maintain that product information, because they never thought about it, 50, 100 years ago. And now they think about it, but you have to be able to age that data, right? Because the systems, as Adam was saying, we're going to get into other computing forms and other data forms and others. I'm sure 10 years from now, it'll be stuff that we don't even think about today. 20 years from now, it'll be maybe significantly different. But if we're not willing to progress the data in a way that we can, again, continue to take advantage of it and understand it at a minimum, then we're going to lose it. And it's going to become the antiquated legacy that is just in a pile in the corner. And I've seen some cases where people have archived the data, but also had to archive the computer system. And computer systems are electrical system. That thing, even if it's sitting there in a corner somewhere, good luck trying to turn that on 10, 15 years from now.
Yeah. My next question, I guess, and you guys were both kind of touching base on it, and it relates to, we always hear, again, the benefits of standards, and we always hear this common theme that it needs to be pushed from the customers or the owners, because the vendors will not push it. And I know you've listed some examples where that worked, and I'm just, I guess the question I have is, how realistic is that for the future of data standardization? And the reason I ask is because, being in the industry for, over 20 years, it's a common theme today as it was before. And I'm just wondering if there's an end in sight, if you will, or something that's changing the way that we're looking about standards.
Yes and no. I mean, people are people. I mean, ultimately, you're in an industrial company, what is it in for you to decide to agree on it, to work with other people and other companies that are competitors on a common standard? There's not a whole lot that says you should go do that if they're a competitor to you. Now, when you start realizing that you're forcing other things on your supply chain and other things that are costing you money, then you might be, and that's where some of these action groups, these more industry-focused action groups, have taken that on as a better understanding. Again, we've seen that in automotive, we see that in aerospace and some others. Marine industry tends to be a little bit of a lagger in that. But again, there's that opportunity as the industry uses more suppliers for systems and other things, then it becomes more real. But then you get the other third parties like the OMGs or the ISO standards groups and others to go support that. So I do think it's more recognized today. But still, there's not a panacea, because tell me why would I work with a competitor on a standard if it's only going to help them? Wait, well, help me, but help them. Yeah, it better out, the benefits better outweigh my hassle of working with a competitor, and that's difficult for a lot of people to swallow, at least in my experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's also the marine industry is so big. There are so many different types of companies out there. So for your large OEM, they can apply pressure and just say this is going to happen. For the military, they tend to be quite slow to react because they've got to worry so much about security that I think that they spend so long worrying about it, they often don't quite get around to changing some of the things that they'd quite like to. And it's really difficult for them to pre-think through all those potential things. For the smaller companies, then I think that that's where the real benefits will come in the supply chain, because it'll really help them stopping having to change all the time. They can't afford to bring in people with those skill sets automatically. It's short term for something that may only last 3 to 5 years and is a bit of a current trend. So I think that there's a lot of those companies, and perhaps the supply chain as well is a key part of all of this. OEMs thinking a little bit more about those key suppliers that they need to keep afloat for them to be able to deliver what they do. And that might be a bit more of the pressure around wanting to do some of these things.
Yeah. I've definitely seen a trend in more inquiries about using data standards. I'm not sure if they're using the data standards, but there's more questions. And I guess one of the things I was thinking about was, because there's more appreciation of the value of the total cost of ownership of the vessel, and you need that digital information for to improve your maintenance, that therefore you need that digital information in a way that would be sustainable for the many decades that you have your vessel. So it ends up being a little bit more top of mind, and I'm seeing a little bit more questions and pressure from the owner operators to push down to the shipyards and design agencies and so forth. So it's always interesting if that's going to be the catalytic mechanism to change it.
It's probably one of them, because the defense side of the house is a little bit easier. I mean, historically, the U.S. DoD has driven a lot of standards, and a lot of other military, MOD in the UK and others have kind of picked up on a number of those things, because they just the sheer volume that the U.S. buys compared to most other militaries. So you have some opportunity to maybe drive some standards, but in the commercial side, that just doesn't exist. I mean, there's some international groups and there's some regulations about, you have to be able to tell me what's on that ship that comes into a port. And so you have to have a information configuration of like hazardous materials and things like that. So there's some international standards. And there was a group at one point that was trying to get a standard for containerization, not the size of the containers. That finally happened. I mean, that took decades to do, but that's there today. But it was about standardization of how to track containers. Mm-hmm. So in rail systems, you track containers, actually, or rail cars. All the countries I know of anyway, that I'm familiar with in Europe and the US, North America, there's a pretty good way of tracking the rail cars when you're shipping something and being able to, split it off and put it onto another train and so on. Well, they were trying to do the same thing globally for containers on ships, but they just couldn't get, I mean, it was about traceability, and there's security reasons why you want to do that and some other stuff, but they just couldn't get, enough governments to say, yeah, we want it. So you have to have some kind of a big hammer or something, or mallet, for people to say, kind of be forced into it in a way. And as Adam was saying, the big OEMs can kind of force their supply chain into doing something, but there's so many smaller companies out there that they just don't have any say, or they're not being required to go do it. So they're going to do what's easiest. And that's vendors, as Dennis, you mentioned, the vendors, they're happy to do it if you pay them. But if you're not going to pay them for it, they might as well stay with what they do. One, they do it already. And two, I think some vendors, quite frankly, like the proprietary formats, and maybe for two reasons. One is, I think a lot of them believe it's better and it operates better. I do think, though, some of them think that way, so you get lock-in. I don't think anyone would admit to that, but I do think that seems to be the case anyway in behavior at times.
Yeah, and I think just one element that we've sort of gone around but not quite said, I think, is understanding the value. And I think that's one thing that companies aren't doing particularly well in a data sense right now, is understanding the value of that data. And so they're afraid to collaborate because they're not quite sure how much the data's worth. And therefore, there's an immediate tendency to say no. I think if they had a better valuation of that data, they'd be willing to share in areas where it's pre-competitive. But I'm not sure companies have really got that feeling just yet. I mean, I'm an academic, but when I go and talk to some companies and they tell me where their data is, sorry, where their value is around their data, I'm thinking that doesn't seem very valuable to me as an academic. I feel like I could easily replace that. But you often see something they do have that's very valuable. It's just that they're not sort of quite working out maybe a sense of exactly what that data's worth just yet, and therefore can't collaborate.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of key points. We can have that discussion or talk about it for a while for lock-in and proprietary information and where the value is. But I do want to, we only have 10 more minutes here, and I want to move on to the digital workforce, and which also includes, we'll say, mindset and culture. And this is actually one area that is really dear and near to my heart. And I think actually on PI Marine, I did a presentation on a portion of this, mainly on culture and mindset in our industry, and really was focusing on, we always talk about this people, process, and tools, and we focus almost all our time on process and tools, and we choose, and I say choose deliberately, because we choose to ignore the people and the culture, because it is difficult. But if we look at a lot of our challenges that we have here, it really starts with people and the culture and mindset. So I really do think it's a significant importance for our industry as well as other industries. So I guess my first question is, what do you think is the importance of, we'll say, transforming our workforce to be more digitally savvy, as well as having a different culture, such as a culture of embracing change?
I think it's critical. Or if you're really going to maximize your return on investment, and if you don't deal with the most, I think, agree with you, Dennis, the most important aspect is the people aspect, that you're never going to get the value potential that's there. And you're going to, it's kind of the expression is, you don't put new wine in old barrels. So if you say, okay, here's a new tool, here's a new process, but you don't train people to use it in the right way and getting them to understand how. I'll give you an example: additive manufacturing. A lot of people think of additive manufacturing as a new way to manufacture. Well, while that's true, you have to design differently. You have to design from an assembly perspective, not a part perspective. Just as a small example, you have to use simulation. You can use topology topology optimization, other techniques. It's totally different than what most people learned on how to design something. They've learned from a subtractive manner, but we're not teaching people necessarily how to use an additive way of actually creating something. And a lot of companies really are struggling with it because they're not getting a change in the way that the design is done itself. And so you see this over and over again in organizations. I want the new tool, change my process, but then people continue to work behind the scenes and using their old way of doing things, and a lot of times even expanding the old way of doing things to circumvent the new way.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm on board with training, working at a university. I mean, it's what we do. So we're already, looking at this very much in terms of how do we develop graduates for the future who are prepared for this level. But I think when I talk to a lot of companies, it's about how do I get young people into my firm who understand this stuff. I don't think it's just that at all. I think it's very much from the CEO down to the shop floor. Everyone needs to have some understanding of how this works and how it's going to influence them, even from at least a perspective of this isn't going to take my job. It's going to help me do my job in a nicer way or more easily. To management being able to make good decisions. Again, it comes back to the value thing. If people don't understand how all these different tools work, then they can't choose the right tools, they can't put processes in place, and they can't really work out what their US or how this interlinks with their USPs. So I think it's across from the very top all the way down. Everyone needs to be working out how much more they need to be knowing about this. They don't automatically need to know the maths behind a neural network, but they probably do need to have at least an understanding of how this all fits into their business.
Yeah, and I have to echo what you just said there, Adam. It's because a lot of the stuff that we've been seeing about improving our digital workforce really is from the bottom up, which I think is important, absolutely. But there is some significant, I think, potential improvements or gaps from the leadership from the top all the way down. We'll see more for the higher levels that can facilitate that information down. And I totally 100% agree with you on that.
Yeah, I want to add to it because it kind of I'll get on my soapbox, so to speak, is thinking differently, thinking from a systems perspective, And I look at a lot of like MBA schools, management business, schools, where at least in North America and what I'm familiar with in Europe as well, where we're still teaching division of labor, very hierarchical structures where you divide labor up, and no one, until you get to maybe a COO, a chief operating officer, or the CEO, do they have a end-to-end view or end-to-end responsibility. Problem is they don't really have an end-to-end understanding because they've divided that responsibility up, understandably so. And if you think about it, that structure goes back to at least the Roman legions. It's about communicating information and orders down a structure. Well, we have different ways we can communicate and collaborate now, in the last 10, 20, 30 years that should allow us to blow that structure up and have a new structure. And I've talked to leading MBA schools in North America, some pretty good schools, saying, what are you doing about this? How are you educating the new leaders of business to take an end-to-end view of their business? Because if they're not doing that, they're never going to optimize. They'll sub-optimize, but they will never really fully optimize as a result of that. And so far, I've seen very few examples of where they're really training the business leaders of tomorrow to think in a broader systems sense. We do see some of that in the systems engineering, some other disciplines lower down, but not at the top. And if we don't see it at the top, we're going to have continue to have a disconnect.
100% agree. Yep. A few more minutes, and I'm going to have one more question, then I'll have one last one for the end. But I did want to ask Adam, especially here, because you did mention about the digital taking away jobs, and I know you're in the area of AI, and there's this huge concern that AI is going to take jobs away. I'd like to get what your perspective on that is.
Yeah, so we actually got this at the roundtable I did yesterday, and I was talking with someone from a company I work with, and we were actually able to talk about a nice scenario where the AI that I've developed has gone into their company and they've developed new jobs to continue to develop it. And so I think in many cases it's much more about that side of things. It's probably going to open up new possibilities, make things efficient, or at least at the very worst move people around a little bit within those positions. I don't think that a lot of these jobs are going to just disappear based on AI, because like we said right at the beginning, or Peter said right at the beginning, these can't make your decisions for you. You still need people. All it's really doing is augmenting those people and sort of making them more like a superhuman.
Yeah, perfect. So with the last couple minutes here, I thought I'd ask each of you guys that we've talked a lot about a lot of different topics. If you were going to talk about the most important thing, or what you would want the audience to take away from the discussion points, what would it be? So you each have 1 minute.
All right. So your information, your product information, your intellectual property is the core of your business. That's your gold. And that's what you have to manage. And you have to do that to maximizes your return on investment from an organizational perspective. And if you don't have good plans to go take advantage of that information from the long term and see how that fits into your value chain, then you're never going to be as successful as you could be. So, and to me, at the end of the day, your product and services are a result of the information that you've defined what it will be. And if that information is not managed right, it's not accessible, you can't leverage it long term, then you're going to continue to be just as inefficient as you are today. So think data first, and then the technology, process, and then the technology. You'll be much better off. And of course, the people are the ones that create that information, and they're the ones that use it. So the people cannot be removed from the equation.
Yeah, I think for me, it's about the ever-changing landscape. We've talked a lot about the fact that in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, things are probably going to look very, very different to the way they do now. So hopefully people are looking to universities to work with them to talk about what's coming up in 10 or 20 years, but thinking about that now, but also feeding back into universities about how we can train the people for tomorrow, and what we've got available to us now that could potentially make a difference to their business, say tomorrow or the day after, because there's lots of things hidden at universities that people don't always know about. So it's a bit of a selfish perspective, but that's where I work, and hopefully we can help with that change management over the coming decades.
Perfect. That's okay to have that plug in there. That's fine. Well, thank you very much, Peter and Adam. Hopefully the audience got a lot of value from this panel. I definitely have a lot of thinking to do from the questions or the answers you guys had. And yeah, I hope everyone has a great rest of the conference.
Thanks very much, both of you.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Take care.